A 14-year-old girl struck her mother's boyfriend fatally with a kitchen knife, ruled justifiable homicide. And decades later, Hollywood's most glamorous star would confess, "My daughter shouldn't have been in that position. She was 14. She should have been worried about school dances, not whether her mother was going to survive the night." The Mexican who became everyone but himself, Antonio Rodolfo Quinn Oaxaca, was born in Chihuahua, Mexico in 1915. By the time Hollywood knew him, he was simply Anthony Quinn, a name that could belong to anyone from anywhere, which was precisely the point. His father's Irish surname became his passport to an industry that would cast him as Greeks in Zorba the Greek, Arabs in Lawrence of Arabia, Italians in La Strada, Eskimos, Native Americans, Armenians, practically every ethnicity imaginable. He won 2 Academy Awards, playing characters from cultures not his own. He became one of the most versatile character actors in Hollywood history, celebrated for his ability to transform into anyone, that is, except himself. In 1952, Quinn was called to a meeting at 20th Century Fox. They wanted him for a role, a Mexican revolutionary leader. The character was heroic, complex, exactly the kind of part Quinn had trained his whole life to play. But there was a problem. The studio insisted on casting a white actor in the lead role and offering Quinn the sidekick, the comedic Mexican bandit who existed to make the Anglo hero look good. When Quinn protested, suggesting he could play the lead, the executive laughed. "Tony, you're great at playing Arabs and Greeks, but we need someone believable as a Mexican." The irony was so sharp, it could cut. This was the moment Quinn understood. His own identity was the one mask he could never wear. The worst part wasn't the rejection, it was what came after. That same year, Quinn watched from the sidelines as the film went into production. The white actor cast as the Mexican revolutionary couldn't speak Spanish, so Quinn was hired to coach him on pronunciation. He stood there, feeding his own language to a man wearing a bronzer, teaching him how to say words Quinn had been told not to speak in public. The paycheck for coaching was a fraction of what he would have earned playing the role himself. This became the pattern. Quinn training other actors to play his culture, then watching them collect awards for authenticity he'd provided but couldn't embody on screen. In 1957, he coached yet another actor for yet another authentic Mexican role. On the final day of coaching, Quinn's wife found him sitting alone in their car in the studio parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, unable to go home yet. "How much longer can I do this?" he asked her. She had no answer. What audiences never understood was that Anthony Quinn couldn't play the one role that was genuinely his, a Mexican man. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when Quinn was building his career, Hollywood operated under rigid restrictions based on prejudice that barred Latino actors from leading roles or even substantial character parts, unless those parts were demeaning stereotypes. Bandits, servants, comic relief, these were the roles available to actors who Hollywood knew were Mexican. Leading men, romantic figures, complex characters with depth and dignity, those went to Anglo actors, even when those characters were supposed to be Latino. The absurdity of Quinn's situation would be almost comical if it weren't so tragic. Studios would cast white actors in brown face makeup to play Mexican characters in films like Viva Zapata, while the actual Mexican Anthony Quinn stood by playing everyone else's culture. He could be heroic, romantic, complex, as long as he wasn't authentically himself. His Irish surname, inherited from his half-Irish father, became the thin membrane separating career success from career annihilation. Studio publicity departments carefully maintained what they called his ethnic ambiguity, marketing him as an international man of mystery rather than specifying his actual background. But the cost of this professional necessity extended far beyond Quinn's own identity. He rarely spoke Spanish in public settings, downplayed his Mexican heritage in interviews, and maintained a careful distance from his cultural roots. This wasn't mere careerism. It was survival in an industry that would have relegated him to bit parts and stereotypes if they'd fully grasped his background. The running became so habitual, so deeply embedded in his professional persona, that it created distances he later struggled to bridge. In the 1960s and 70s, as the Chicano civil rights movement gained momentum and Hollywood's restrictions slowly began to crack, Quinn finally started publicly acknowledging his Mexican heritage. He spoke more openly about his origins, his family, his connection to Mexican culture. But by then, decades had passed. In later interviews, particularly near the end of his life, Quinn expressed something close to regret about the cultural silence his career had required. He'd spent so many years running from his Mexican identity, perfecting the art of being everyone else, that reclaiming himself felt like learning a language he'd once spoken fluently, but had been forbidden to use. The individual who could transform into any character on screen had spent decades unable to openly claim the one identity that was genuinely his, until the industry finally changed enough to allow it. But you can't reclaim lost years. You can't undo the running, even when you finally stop. Anthony Quinn became everyone the camera needed him to be, except the person he'd been born as. That transformation, unlike the ones he performed on screen, left marks that makeup couldn't cover. The woman who erased her mother and mixed-race heritage, Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson, was born in Bombay, India in 1911. But Hollywood never knew that name, never knew that birthplace, never knew the truth about the elegant woman they called Merle Oberon. To movie audiences, she was an aristocratic British beauty from Tasmania, Australia. Sophisticated, refined, the epitome of European elegance. She starred opposite Laurence Olivier in Wuthering Heights, captivating audiences with her striking features and undeniable screen presence. Everything about her background seemed impeccable, carefully documented, utterly convincing. Everything was a lie. The truth was devastating in its complexity. Merle's mother, Constance, had been barely 14 years old when she gave birth, likely the victim of assault by her own stepfather, Arthur Thompson. To protect the young girl from this horrific reality and shield the child from the shame of her origins, Merle's grandmother Charlotte made an agonizing decision. She would raise Merle as her own daughter, while Constance would be introduced as the child's older sister. The baby would never know the truth about her mother's trauma or her own origins. This family deception might have remained private, known only to those directly involved, if Merle hadn't become a movie star. But when she did, the stakes changed entirely. The studio system discovered her mixed-race heritage. Her mother's family had Indian ancestry. And in an industry where racial purity was an unspoken requirement for leading ladies, this truth could end her career before it began. The solution required expanding the family's private deception into a public fiction. Studio publicists crafted an entirely new background for Merle Oberon. They claimed she'd been born in Tasmania, Australia, a location chosen with deliberate calculation. A fire had destroyed many Tasmanian birth records, making verification virtually impossible. They invented aristocratic connections, fabricated a refined British upbringing, created a past that would make her acceptable to audiences who would never have embraced a mixed-race actress from Bombay's slums, no matter how talented or beautiful. But maintaining this fiction required constant vigilance and heartbreaking sacrifices. Merle's actual mother, Constance, had to watch her daughter's success from the shadows. Always introduced as the older sister, never acknowledged as the mother who had given birth to her. At premieres and parties, when Merle posed for photographs with the elegant woman presented as her mother, actually her grandmother Charlotte, Constance stood nearby in her assigned role as sibling, witnessing the erasure of her motherhood. The psychological toll on all three women was immense. Charlotte, playing mother to her granddaughter, carrying the weight of the original deception. Constance denied public acknowledgement of her motherhood, watching her daughter shine while she remained in shadow. And Merle herself, living in constant terror that someone from her past in India might recognize her, that some journalist might dig too deeply, that the carefully constructed facade might crack. Even as Merle underwent painful treatments to lighten her complexion, electrolysis to alter her hairline, specialized makeup and lighting techniques to make her appear more conventionally European, she knew the truth could never be entirely erased. It lived in her memories, in her features, in the woman who called herself her sister, but whose eyes held a mother's love. At one premiere in 1948, a photographer asked Merle and her sister Constance to pose together. Constance placed her hand on Merle's shoulder, a gesture so natural, so maternal, and the photographer said, "No, not like that. You look like her mother standing that way." Constance dropped her hand. Merle felt her mother's fingers slip away from her shoulder and knew they could never touch that way in public again. From that moment on, Constance kept physical distance at every event, standing just far enough away that no photographer would ever make that mistake again. The space between them in photographs measured the cost of their deception. At home, behind closed doors, Constance would sometimes hold Merle's face in her hands and whisper, "You're my daughter, you're my daughter." Merle would close her eyes and pretend, just for those few seconds, that the world knew the truth. The years passed, and the deception became so habitual that even Merle sometimes felt disconnected from her own history. She'd perfected the accent, the mannerisms, the stories about growing up in Tasmania. She could recite details of a childhood that never happened with such conviction that even she occasionally forgot where the performance ended and reality began. But late at night, alone in her dressing room after a premiere or a photo shoot, she'd look at her reflection and see her mother's eyes staring back at her. The same eyes that watched from the shadows, always present but never acknowledged. Perhaps most heartbreaking was Merle's inability to tell the truth even at the end. When she lay approaching her final days in 1979, her husband and children still didn't know the real story. Her mother, Constance, had left this world 3 years earlier in 1976, having never been publicly acknowledged by the daughter she'd sacrificed so much to protect. The woman who had illuminated screens in some of Hollywood's most memorable films kept her own mother in permanent shadow until both their lives ended. Only years later, when biographers began tracking down birth records in India and interviewing distant relatives who remembered the family's history, did the truth emerge. By then, all three women were gone. The running had lasted their entire lives, and the secrets went to the grave with them. Merle Oberon became the sophisticated British beauty Hollywood wanted her to be. But the cost was erasing not just her heritage, but her mother's very identity. Running from mental illness, abuse, and the mirror. Constance Frances Marie Ockelman was born in Brooklyn in 1922, and the childhood she was running from bore no resemblance to Hollywood glamour. Her mother suffered from severe mental illness and required institutionalization when Constance was young. For a child watching her mother disappear into psychiatric facilities, the fear wasn't just about loss, it was about inheritance. Would the same madness that had claimed her mother eventually claim her too? Was it already there, dormant, waiting? Her stepfather was reportedly abusive, adding another layer of trauma to an already damaged childhood. By the time she reached Hollywood, Constance had learned to bury everything beneath the manufactured persona of Veronica Lake. The studios loved her look, that signature peekaboo blonde hair falling seductively over one eye. She became film noir incarnate, the sultry mystery woman opposite Alan Ladd in This Gun for Hire. The fantasy that made women copy her hairstyle until the United States government asked her to change it because women working in war factories were getting their hair caught in machinery. But what seemed like a blessing became its own kind of prison. As trends changed and the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, studios refused to let her evolve beyond the peekaboo girl image. She felt trapped playing the same sultry roles, unable to demonstrate her range or grow as an actress. She began drinking heavily to cope with the fear, the memories, the feeling of being locked inside an image that no longer fit. The alcohol gave her a reputation for being difficult on set, and in an industry that demanded compliance from its actresses, difficult meant unemployable. By the late 1940s, major studios had dropped her. The woman who had been one of Hollywood's highest-paid actresses in 1943 found herself scrambling for work in low-budget productions, then in television, then nowhere at all. The running accelerated. Failed marriages, each one perhaps an attempt to find stability she'd never known as a child. Bankruptcy, her money gone as quickly as her fame. Through it all, the drinking continued, the only reliable escape from the terror that her mother's fate might become her own. She was running from madness, from an image that had become a cage, from a mirror that showed her aging out of the only identity Hollywood had ever allowed her. By the late 1960s, Veronica began experiencing episodes that terrified her. Blackouts she couldn't explain, moments of confusion where she didn't recognize familiar places. Her hands would shake uncontrollably, not from alcohol withdrawal, though that made it worse, but from something deeper. She refused to see doctors, terrified of what they might diagnose. The genetic lottery she'd been running from her entire life might have finally caught up, or perhaps it was just age and alcohol and decades of running. She'd never know for certain. She'd rather pass wondering than face the confirmation. In 1973, at age 50, the woman who had once been worth millions and had her image plastered on posters across America breathed her last working as a cocktail lounge hostess in a New York hotel. Most of the customers she served had no idea who she'd been. One night near the end, a customer at the hotel lounge where she worked asked if anyone had ever told her she looked like Veronica Lake. She'd heard this before, the resemblance to her former self still visible beneath the years and alcohol. "I get that sometimes," she said, pouring his drink. He laughed. "You should have been in the pictures. You could have been somebody." She took his money, gave him his change, and said nothing. The woman who had once been somebody served the man who thought she could have been. The circle was complete. She kept his $5 tip, the same amount she'd once spent on a single cocktail at the Brown Derby. The irony wasn't lost on her. Friends who saw her in those final years said she was still running from the mother's illness she feared was in her genetic code, from the peekaboo image that had imprisoned her, from the reflection that reminded her she'd lost everything the running was supposed to protect. Veronica Lake never stopped fleeing. She just ran out of places to hide. The glamorous facade crumbled, the money evaporated, the fame turned to obscurity, but the running continued until there was nothing left to run from and nowhere left to go. The man who erased his entire past to become someone else. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. was born in Winnetka, Illinois, in 1925. Hollywood never knew that name or that person. They knew only Rock Hudson, tall, handsome, the masculine ideal who made women swoon in romantic comedies opposite Doris Day. But Roy Scherer and Rock Hudson weren't just different names. They were fundamentally different people, and maintaining that separation required running from his authentic self every single day. Roy was a shy, gentle young man who'd worked as a truck driver before being discovered. He was also a gay man in an era when that orientation could lead to arrest, institutionalization, or violent assault. In Hollywood specifically, it meant career annihilation. The 1950s studio system built male stars on images of virile heterosexuality, leading men who made female audiences fantasize about romance. A gay actor playing romantic leads wasn't just professionally unacceptable, it was considered a kind of fraud against the audience. Agent Henry Wilson specialized in closeted actors, and he saw potential in Roy Scherer. But first, Roy had to disappear. Wilson created Rock Hudson from nothing, the name chosen for its masculine strength, the biography carefully fabricated. Even Roy's natural mannerisms coached and altered to project the right kind of masculinity. This wasn't acting coaching for roles. This was identity reconstruction for survival. The manufactured person worked beautifully. Rock Hudson became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, the ultimate bachelor every woman wanted to marry. But in 1955, whispers about his private life began threatening his carefully constructed image. Wilson's solution was ruthless in its efficiency. Arrange a marriage to prove Rock's heterosexuality. The bride would be Wilson's own secretary, Phyllis Gates, who may or may not have known the truth about why she was being married to Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. The marriage lasted 3 miserable years before ending in divorce in 1958. For Rock, it had been a performance more exhausting than any film role, maintaining the fiction at home, in public, in every moment. Meanwhile, his actual emotional life remained completely hidden. In the late 1950s, he began a relationship with partner Robert Benavides that would last for decades, but always in absolute secrecy. They couldn't live openly together, couldn't be photographed together, couldn't acknowledge their relationship to anyone outside a tiny circle of trusted friends. The running took different forms at different times. Sometimes it was literal, leaving parties separately, maintaining separate residences for public records, carefully choreographed arrivals and departures to avoid suspicion. Sometimes it was bureaucratic. The Federal Bureau of Investigation kept a file on his activities, documenting what they called his behavior. Sometimes it was heartbreaking, being unable to visit friends who were gravely ill in hospitals because questions might be asked about why Rock Hudson cared so much about this particular individual. Every premiere, every interview, every public appearance required perfect performance of the heterosexual leading man. Rock Hudson, the person, had to stay hidden so Rock Hudson, the image, could thrive. Roy Scherer was buried so completely that most people forgot he'd ever existed. The running became so habitual, so thoroughly embedded in every aspect of his life, that authenticity itself became something he could only access in the most private, carefully guarded moments. In 1962, Rock Hudson was voted the #1 box office star in America. That same year, he attended a party where a prominent Hollywood producer loudly joked about hunting for queers in the industry. Rock laughed along with everyone else, made a self-deprecating comment about being too much of a ladies' man to worry about such things. Later, a friend found him in the bathroom, hands shaking, unable to catch his breath. This was the cost of the performance, not just hiding who he was, but actively participating in the mockery of people like himself. The biggest star in America, gasping for air in a locked bathroom, terrified that someone might notice he'd been gone too long. Then, in 1985, everything changed. Rock was diagnosed with acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and the disease made hiding impossible. Friends expected him to retreat into secrecy, to fade away quietly without ever acknowledging the truth. Instead, he made a choice that transformed his final months from running to standing still. He became the first major celebrity to publicly reveal his diagnosis, putting a human face on a disease that much of America preferred to ignore or dismiss as punishment for immoral behavior. His announcement on July 25, 1985, shocked the world and immediately doubled donations to organizations researching the illness. He left $250,000 in his will to help establish the American Foundation for Research, using his considerable wealth to fund the fight against what was destroying him. The individual who had run from truth his entire life stopped running at the end. In his final months before his life concluded, on October 2, 1985, the manufactured person of Rock Hudson finally disappeared, and something closer to Roy Scherer emerged. Not completely, because decades of hiding don't vanish overnight, but enough to tell a truth that mattered, enough to help others who were carrying the same secrets he'd hidden for 40 years. In one of his last interviews, conducted from his hospital bed, Rock said something that haunted those who heard it. "I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but if my name helps one person not feel alone, then maybe Roy Scherer's life meant something after all." After 4 decades of being Rock Hudson, he finally spoke of Roy Scherer in the present tense. The running ended with an act of courage that may have saved more lives than any of his films ever touched. These stories only get more devastating from here. Make sure you don't miss the shocking truths we're about to reveal. Subscribe now so you never miss the hidden darkness behind Hollywood's golden age. The inventor who fled an arms dealer's control, Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler, was born in Vienna, Austria in 1914. Hollywood would know her as Hedi Lamarr, often called the most beautiful woman in the world. But beauty, as Hedi discovered, could be its own kind of prison when the jailer was powerful enough. In 1933, at age 19, she married Friedrich Mandl, the third richest individual in Austria and a prominent arms manufacturer who sold weapons to fascist governments across Europe. Mandl saw Hedi as the ultimate acquisition, a stunningly beautiful woman to display at business dinners, a trophy wife to enhance his status. What he didn't see, or didn't care about, was her brilliant mind, her intellectual curiosity, or her growing horror at the world he inhabited. Mandl forced Hedi to play hostess at business dinners attended by representatives of Mussolini's government and various weapons buyers conducting business with Austria's fascist sympathizing elite. She sat at tables where men discussed torpedo guidance systems, radio-controlled weapons, and the machinery of warfare. Mandl was obsessively controlling, monitoring her movements, keeping her isolated from anyone he didn't approve of, treating her less like a wife and more like a particularly valuable possession. By 1937, Hedi had reached her breaking point. She needed to escape not just an unhappy marriage, but a man who would never willingly let her go, and a country sliding toward catastrophe. She fled Austria, made her way to Paris, then London, and finally booked passage to America, leaving everything behind except her determination to reclaim her life and her mind. What Hollywood didn't know, what almost no one knew for years, was that during those business dinners she'd been forced to attend, Hedi had been listening carefully. The discussions of weapons technology, of radio frequencies and guidance systems had fascinated her brilliant mind, even as the company had repulsed her. Years later in America, working with avant-garde composer George Antheil, she developed an idea that had been forming since those Vienna dinners. But Hedi's real prison in Hollywood wasn't just dismissive attitudes. It was the erasure of her intellectual identity. At dinner parties, when she'd try to discuss science or technology, individuals would interrupt her mid-sentence. "Now, Hedi," they'd say with condescending smiles, "let's not hurt that pretty head with all that technical talk." The same conversations she'd been forced to sit through with fascists in Vienna, she was now excluded from in Hollywood, but for the opposite reason. In Austria, she'd been forced to listen because she was Mandel's possession. In America, she was forbidden to participate because she was too beautiful to possibly understand. In 1942, Hedi Lamarr and George Antheil received a patent for frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology, a method of preventing radio-controlled torpedoes from being jammed by enemy signals. The technology was revolutionary, genuinely ahead of its time. It would eventually form the basis for modern Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and global positioning systems. The woman dismissed as merely beautiful had invented technology that would change the world. But here's where the tragedy deepens. The United States Navy looked at the patent submitted by a Hollywood actress and a composer and dismissed it as impractical. She was just an actress after all. What could she possibly understand about weapons technology and radio frequencies? The patent sat unused, and in 1959, it expired without ever being implemented. By the time the technology industry recognized its value decades later, Hedi would receive no compensation. The basis for Wi-Fi, worth billions to the companies who eventually developed it, earned its inventor nothing. In 1997, when Hedi was 83 years old and living in seclusion, she received a phone call from a technology company executive. He wanted to thank her. Their company's Wi-Fi technology was built on her patent. "Will I receive compensation?" she asked. There was a long pause. "The patent expired 38 years ago, Miss Lamarr. We don't owe royalties." She hung up the phone. Her invention would generate trillions of dollars in value for companies around the world. She received a plaque. When asked how she felt about this, she said simply, "It's too late for me to be bitter." But friends said she kept that plaque in a drawer, never displayed, as if looking at it was too painful a reminder of what might have been. She spent her later years as a recluse, struggling financially, while the entire world used technology based on her invention without knowing her name appeared on the patent. Only in the 1990s, when she was in her 80s, did the technology industry finally begin acknowledging her contributions. Awards and recognition came then, but decades too late for her to fully enjoy them or benefit financially from her brilliance. Hedi Lamarr left this world in January 2000, finally recognized as an inventor, but having spent most of her life defined only by her beauty. The woman who had fled Austria to reclaim her mind and her freedom had that mind dismissed by Hollywood for 50 years. She'd escaped one prison, Mandel's controlling mansion, only to find herself in another cage built from beauty and dismissive attitudes toward women. The irony was devastating. The dinners that had shown her the depths of fascist evil had also given her the knowledge to create something genuinely revolutionary. But because she was a woman, because she was an actress, because beauty was supposed to preclude brain power, her invention was ignored until long after the moment when recognition might have changed her life. Fleeing his father's duplicity while living his own, Edward Montgomery Clift was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1920, and from childhood he learned a devastating lesson about deception. Hollywood knew him as Montgomery Clift, sensitive, intense, one of the original method actors who brought unprecedented emotional depth to roles in films like A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity. But the intensity audiences saw on screen had roots in pain that went far beyond acting technique. During his childhood, Montgomery discovered that his father, William Brooks Clift, had conducted extramarital affairs throughout Montgomery's youth. The family he'd believed in, the stability he'd assumed was real, turned out to be built on his father's deceptions. For a child, this kind of discovery rewrites history. Every memory becomes suspect. Every moment of apparent family harmony revealed as performance. His father had been living a double life, and young Montgomery had been unknowingly complicit in maintaining the fiction. The cruel irony was that Montgomery would spend his adult life forced to replicate his father's pattern of duplicity. He was a gay man in an industry that demanded its leading men project heterosexual appeal. Studios aggressively protected his image, arranging publicity dates with actresses, carefully managing his public persona to maintain the fiction of availability to female audiences. His actual relationships with men were kept in absolute secrecy, known only to a small circle of trusted friends. The psychological strain of this dual existence was immense. He was watching his father's deceptive pattern while being forced to live it himself. He was maintaining a public fiction while knowing intimately the damage such fictions could cause. The weight of it drove him to self-medicate with alcohol and prescription pills, numbing the constant anxiety of potential exposure. Then came May 12, 1956. Montgomery was leaving a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's house when he crashed his car into a telephone pole. The impact shattered his face. Broken nose, broken jaw, teeth knocked loose, extensive damage requiring reconstructive surgery. Elizabeth Taylor, hearing the crash, ran to the wreck and reportedly reached into his throat to pull out teeth that were choking him, quite possibly saving his life. What Elizabeth didn't tell anyone for years was what Montgomery said to her in the ambulance. Through his shattered jaw, barely intelligible, he kept repeating, "Don't let them see me. Don't let them see." She thought he meant the photographers, the press, the public. Only later did she realize he meant something deeper. Don't let them see the broken person beneath the beautiful facade. Don't let them see that the mask had finally, literally, shattered. Elizabeth held his hand and promised. She kept that promise for the rest of his life. One of the few people who saw him and loved him anyway. The crash changed everything, whether it was exhaustion, alcohol, the weight of his double life, or simply a tragic accident. No one would ever know for certain. What mattered was what came after. Post-accident, his disfigured and pain-racked face became a kind of external manifestation of what had always been internal anguish. He could hide behind physical damage rather than just emotional secrets. The last decade of his life was a slow decline into increasing dependence on painkillers prescribed for injuries that never fully healed, alcohol consumption that accelerated as internal pain grew worse, and isolation from all but his closest friends. Elizabeth Taylor remained loyal, one of the few people who truly knew him and loved him regardless. He succumbed to a heart attack in July 1966, at age 45. The beautiful, sensitive individual who had brought such emotional truth to his performances had spent his life running from authenticity, forced to hide himself while watching his father's duplicity repeat in his own existence. The crash that destroyed his face seemed to finally give him permission to be broken on the outside in ways he'd always been broken inside. But the relief, if it was relief, came at a devastating cost. Montgomery Clift gave audiences some of the most emotionally honest performances in film history while being unable to live honestly himself. Running from the night, her daughter ended a life to protect her. Julia Jean Turner was born in Wallace, Idaho in 1921. Hollywood would transform her into Lana Turner, the sweater girl, the platinum blonde goddess who epitomized glamour in films like The Postman Always Rings Twice and Peyton Place. But beneath the perfectly composed image was a woman running from a pattern she couldn't seem to break. Dangerous men, volatile relationships, and a terror that her daughter was watching it all, learning that love meant violence. On the night of April 4th, 1958, that pattern reached its devastating conclusion in Lana's Beverly Hills home. Her boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, a known gangster and enforcer for mobster Mickey Cohen, had been growing increasingly violent and possessive. That evening, their argument escalated. Stompanato threatened to disfigure Lana, to destroy her career, to hurt her 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl. The shouting could be heard throughout the house. Cheryl Crane, terrified in her bedroom, heard her mother's screams. She grabbed a kitchen knife and ran to her mother's bedroom. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and headlines for months. Cheryl later testified that she saw Stompanato with his hands on her mother, saw her mother in danger, and stabbed him once in the abdomen. Johnny Stompanato bled out on Lana Turner's bedroom floor. He was 32 years old. The aftermath was a media circus. Lana's daughter was taken into custody. Cameras flashed outside the Beverly Hills police station. The trial became a spectacle. The glamorous movie star and her teenage daughter, the deceased gangster. The question of whether it was an ending or justified protection. The coroner's inquest ruled it justifiable homicide. Cheryl was made a ward of the court and sent to her grandmother's custody. But what the jury didn't see, what Lana was truly running from, was the pattern that had led to that moment. This wasn't her first violent relationship. She'd been married 7 times to 5 different men, many of the relationships marked by jealousy, control, and volatility. Studio executives had warned her about Stompanato and had tried to convince her to end the relationship. She couldn't or wouldn't, and now her daughter had blood on her hands because of it. Lana spent the rest of her life running from that night. She never fully escaped the question, what had she taught her daughter about love? What example had she set by staying with violent men, by returning to relationships that everyone could see were dangerous? Cheryl had learned that when a man threatens your mother, you protect her, whatever the cost. The relationship between mother and daughter never fully recovered. Cheryl later wrote that she'd been protecting her mother, but also that she'd been terrified by the violence she'd witnessed throughout her childhood. Lana maintained publicly that Johnny's passing was tragic but necessary, that her daughter had saved her life. Privately, friends said she was consumed by guilt. Guilt that Cheryl had seen too much, had learned that violence was how you solved problems, and had become the protector when Lana should have been protecting her. In later years, when Lana gave interviews about her tumultuous personal life, she would sometimes pause when asked about that night. "I should have left him months earlier," she said once. "My daughter shouldn't have been in that position. She was 14 years old. She should have been worried about school dances, not whether her mother was going to survive the night." But you can't undo what a child witnesses. You can't erase the moment a daughter decides the only way to save her mother is with a knife. Lana Turner spent the rest of her life running from the pattern she'd created. The dangerous men, the volatile relationships, the night her daughter learned that love and violence were inseparable. Lana reached her final days in June 1995 at age 74. She'd survived 7 marriages, countless affairs, and decades in the spotlight. But she never escaped April 4th, 1958, the night her daughter took the life of a man to protect her. The night that proved Lana had been running toward danger her entire life, and her daughter had been watching the whole time. The barrier breaker who passed running from an industry that never wanted her. Dorothy Jean Dandridge was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1922. In 1954, she became the first African-American woman nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in Carmen Jones. It should have been a triumphant moment, a barrier broken, a signal that Hollywood was finally changing. Instead, it revealed just how little the industry was willing to change and how much punishment awaited those who dared to succeed despite the system's resistance. The cruelty started immediately and never stopped. Dorothy couldn't attend many of her own film premieres because the hotels and restaurants hosting them refused to serve black patrons, even black patrons who were Oscar nominees. Imagine achieving the highest recognition in your field and being barred from your own celebration because of the color of your skin. Imagine studio executives celebrating your barrier-breaking nomination while simultaneously booking venues that wouldn't let you through the door. At the premiere of Carmen Jones in 1954, the very film that earned her the Oscar nomination, Dorothy had to enter through the kitchen entrance of the theater because the front doors were reserved for white patrons only. She walked past dishwashers and cooks in her gown, past garbage bins and mop closets, to reach the screening room where Hollywood would celebrate her barrier-breaking achievement. The applause that greeted her that night came from an audience that wouldn't let her walk through the same door they'd used. What made this moment even more surreal was that Dorothy had prepared two acceptance speeches, one if she won, one if she lost. She'd practiced both in her dressing room that evening, the room she'd accessed through the kitchen. As she stood in the screening room receiving a standing ovation from people who had forced her through the service entrance, she felt the folded papers of both speeches in her purse and thought, "It doesn't matter which one I give. I'll still have to leave the same way I came in." The barrier she'd supposedly broken existed only on stage. Everywhere else, all the doors were still locked. Hollywood's limitations on Dorothy went far beyond premiere access. Despite her extraordinary talent, range, and beauty, studios would only cast her in stereotypical, exotic roles. The sultry other, the tragic mixed-race character, the Caribbean or African woman who existed to fulfill white fantasies. They absolutely refused to cast her opposite white leading men in romantic roles, destroying any possibility of her becoming a traditional leading lady. The very quality that made her nomination groundbreaking, her race, became the ceiling that prevented her from building on that achievement. Meanwhile, her personal life was collapsing under financial pressure. Her daughter, Harolyn, had been born in 1943 with severe brain damage, unable to hear, partially blind, with developmental delays that required permanent institutional care. Dorothy and her first husband, Oleg Cassini, had quietly placed Harolyn in a specialized facility, keeping it hidden from the public to protect Dorothy's career. But the costs of that care were astronomical and never-ending. Then came the exploitation by her managers. Like many performers of her era, Dorothy had signed contracts that gave managers enormous control over her earnings. These individuals systematically stole from her, siphoning money while she worked constantly to pay for her daughter's care and maintain her career. By the early 1960s, despite her fame and groundbreaking achievement, Dorothy was financially devastated. The combination of financial ruin, limited career opportunities due to prejudice, the constant pain of having a daughter she couldn't care for herself, and the depression of watching her barrier-breaking moment lead nowhere beyond more barriers, it became unbearable. She turned to antidepressant medication and alcohol, seeking escape from an impossible situation. She was running from an industry that would never truly accept her, no matter how talented she was. From financial ruin she couldn't escape despite working constantly, from the heartbreak of a daughter who would never improve. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy was discovered unresponsive in her small West Hollywood apartment at age 42. The cause was an accidental overdose of antidepressant medication. The woman who had broken Hollywood's color barrier left this world alone and nearly penniless. Her potential never fully realized because the industry she'd integrated had never stopped punishing her for daring to succeed. The first Black Oscar nominee departed, forgotten by the same Hollywood that had celebrated her nomination 11 years earlier. She'd spent her entire career running from oppression that followed her everywhere. From the prejudice that limited every opportunity, from the financial catastrophe of her daughter's care, from the depression of knowing that her talent and achievement would never be enough to overcome the color of her skin. But there was nowhere to run in an industry built on excluding people who looked like her. Dorothy Dandridge left us still running, and the barriers she'd broken remained mostly symbolic for decades to come. These institutional betrayals, Lana's pattern of violence, Hollywood's oppression of Dorothy, show how the system itself created what these stars were running from. Which of these injustices has affected you most? And what Golden Age topics should we explore next? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and your suggestions shape the stories we tell. Running from the father who allegedly assaulted her, forced to become the fantasy he exploited. Margarita Carmen Cancino was born in Brooklyn in 1918 to a family of Spanish dancers. Hollywood would transform her into Rita Hayworth, the love goddess who defined glamour and sensuality in films like Gilda. But according to what Rita revealed to her second husband Orson Welles, accounts never independently verified, but consistent with her lifelong struggles, the sensuality that made her famous had roots in childhood trauma so horrific that it shaped everything about who she became. From age 12, Rita's father, Eduardo Cancino, forced her to perform as his dance partner. touring seedy casino towns along the Mexican border. During these tours, Eduardo began harming her in unspeakable ways. The father who should have been protecting his daughter was exploiting her in the most devastating way possible, violating her while teaching her to perform for audiences who had no idea what they were witnessing. The studio transformation of Margarita into Rita Hayworth took this exploitation and made it profitable. Columbia Pictures changed her name to sound less Spanish, dyed her naturally black hair auburn, and subjected her to painful electrolysis treatments to alter her hairline and make her look less Latina. They fabricated an Anglo background, erasing her Spanish heritage to make her acceptable to mainstream audiences. The woman emerging from this process was a complete fiction. New name, new hair, new face, new background. But Eduardo Cancino remained involved, managing his daughter's early career and profiting financially from the persona he had exploited and damaged. For Rita, there was no escape. The father who had committed these acts against her was still there, still benefiting from her success, still part of the machinery that had transformed her into America's fantasy. Rita herself seemed painfully aware of the disconnection between her public image and private reality. She famously said, "They go to bed with Gilda and wake up with me." She understood that audiences were responding to a performance, to a persona that had been shaped by childhood trauma she couldn't escape. The woman playing the confident seductress was performing a fantasy built on her father's crimes. On the set of Gilda, the director needed Rita to perform the famous "Put the Blame on Mame" number, a scene dripping with sensuality and confidence. Between takes, Rita sat in her dressing room, shaking. The choreographer found her and asked what was wrong. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Do what?" he asked. "This," she gestured at the costume, the set, herself. "Pretend to be someone who enjoys this." The choreographer thought she was having performance anxiety. She wasn't. She was having a moment of devastating clarity about what her entire career was built on. Then she went back out and did the take perfectly. That's what professionals do. Her pattern of marriages seemed to unconsciously replicate harmful dynamics, relationships with powerful men, marriages that ended badly, a constant search for something she could never quite find. Wells, who claimed to know the truth about her father, watched with compassion as Rita struggled with demons she couldn't publicly name or escape. Then in her 40s, Rita began showing symptoms that were initially dismissed as alcoholism and erratic behavior. The real cause was early-onset Alzheimer's disease, which would eventually steal all her memories, including, perhaps mercifully, the painful ones. Wells, one of the few who understood what she'd survived, watched tragically as the disease progressed through the 1970s and 80s. In her final years in an Alzheimer's facility, Rita would sometimes revert to speaking Spanish, the language she'd been taught to suppress, the heritage she'd been forced to erase. It was as if her true identity, the one buried under Rita Hayworth's manufactured facade, was finally breaking through. The woman who had been running from her father's crimes since age 12 could finally stop running, but only because the disease had destroyed the memories she'd been fleeing. Rita took her final breath in May 1987 at age 68, her mind gone, the past she'd run from finally erased by illness. Whether Wells's account was accurate remains unverified. What's certain is that Rita Hayworth spent her life performing a persona that made her famous, while apparently feeling profoundly disconnected from the image she projected. The love goddess departed, having perhaps never felt truly loved in the way she needed, running from shadows that followed her until disease finally made running unnecessary. Running from the fan who destroyed her daughter's life. Jean Eliza Tierney was born in Brooklyn in 1920 to a wealthy family. Hollywood made her one of the most beautiful and acclaimed actresses of the 1940s, starring in films like Laura, Leave Her to Heaven, and Heaven Can Wait. Elegant, graceful, seemingly living a charmed life, the perfect image of old Hollywood glamour. But in 1943, during the height of World War II, while Jean was pregnant with her first child, something happened that would shatter that perfect image and haunt her for decades. Jean worked tirelessly during the war years, entertaining troops, attending events to support the war effort, meeting with fans who adored her. At one such event, an enthusiastic young woman approached her. It was a brief encounter, probably lasting only moments. A handshake, perhaps an autograph, certainly a smile and kind words. Jean thought nothing of it at the time. Just another fan meeting, another moment of connection. Shortly afterward, Jean contracted rubella, commonly called German measles. For most people, it's a relatively mild illness. But for pregnant women, particularly in early pregnancy, rubella can be catastrophic. In 1944, Jean gave birth to her daughter Daria. The baby was severely disabled, unable to hear, partially blind, with developmental delays that meant she would never be able to live independently. The rubella infection had caused devastating damage. Jean and her husband, Oleg Cassini, made the agonizing decision to place Daria in a specialized institution where she could receive the care they couldn't provide at home. They kept this decision largely hidden from the public, protecting Jean's career, but at enormous emotional cost. The secret consumed her. The guilt wondering what she could have done differently, whether she should have been more careful, whether she should have limited public appearances during pregnancy, became overwhelming. Her mental health began deteriorating. Depression set in, deepening into something more severe. She was hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric treatment, then began a series of electroshock therapy sessions, 27 treatments in total that destroyed portions of her memory, including happy moments with her second daughter, Christina. The treatments were brutal, leaving her feeling confused and brutalized, but she kept trying anything that might help her process the grief and guilt. Then came the moment that made everything infinitely worse. Years after Daria's birth, Jean attended a party. That same young woman who had approached her in 1943 was there. In the course of conversation, the woman casually mentioned how thrilled she'd been to meet Jean back then. So thrilled that she'd broken quarantine while infected with rubella because she just couldn't miss the chance to meet her idol. The woman knew. She'd known for years that she'd been carrying the illness when she approached pregnant Jean Tierney. She'd known the risks and chosen to go anyway because meeting a movie star was more important than protecting a stranger's unborn child. And now she was standing there, years later, apparently unaware or uncaring about what her thoughtless act had cost. Jean said nothing. The rage, the grief, the desire to scream at this woman who had destroyed her daughter's life through sheer selfishness. It all had nowhere to go. For years afterward, Jean would dream of that moment, imagining the confrontation she never had, the words she never spoke, the justice that never came. What Jean never told anyone, not even her autobiography, was that she had seen that woman at other events over the years. At a 1952 charity function, at a 1958 gallery opening, always at a distance, always smiling, always oblivious. Each time, Jean felt her chest tighten, felt the words rising in her throat. Each time she said nothing. She would go home and hold her daughter Christina a little tighter, terrified that someone might take her too. The guilt became a kind of madness. Guilt for not protecting Daria. Guilt for resenting a thoughtless fan. Guilt for continuing her career while her daughter lived in an institution. Guilt for even thinking about all the what-ifs. 27 electroshock treatments couldn't erase that particular guilt. Jean couldn't publicly confront her without revealing Daria's existence and condition, without destroying the privacy she'd carefully maintained. So she absorbed it, carried it, added it to the weight of everything else she was running from. The running continued, from the guilt that consumed her, from the memories that electroshock therapy was destroying, from the anger at a thoughtless fan that she could never express, from the institutional facility where her daughter lived and would always live. She was running from one moment in 1943, one handshake with an infected fan, that had changed everything forever. Eventually, Jean found some measure of stability. Her marriage to oil baron W. Howard Lee, beginning in 1960, brought a degree of peace she hadn't known in years. The psychiatric episodes became less frequent. She learned to live with grief that would never fully heal. In 1979, she published her autobiography, finally telling the story of Daria and the thoughtless fan, making clear that some wounds never fully close. Jean reached her final days in November 1991 at age 70. She'd survived the darkness, the psychiatric hospitals, the electroshock treatments, the decades of guilt and grief, but she'd never escaped it. The woman who had brought such beauty to the screen spent much of her life running from one careless moment, one thoughtless act by a fan who valued meeting a star more than protecting the health of a stranger's baby. What made them golden wasn't the absence of shadows. It was the courage to shine despite them. They ran while creating art that outlived the darkness. They ran while giving us performances that still move us. They transformed pain into beauty, secrets into art, running into transcendence. If these truths have changed how you see these legends, please like this video and share it with fellow classic film lovers. Thank you for this journey through difficult stories that deserve to be told with honesty and respect. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, where we remember Hollywood's legends as they truly were. Beautifully flawed, courageously complex, and profoundly human.